Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Roz Thompson, Public Affairs Specialist with AAA Northeast, and welcome to our discussion on the legalization of marijuana in New Jersey. In November, voters approved a ballot that would legalize marijuana for both recreational and medicinal use. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy signed the bill on February 22nd, and we would join 16 states that have legalized cannabis. As more states move toward legalization, there are growing concerns associated with marijuana impaired driving. According to the AAA Foundation for Research, when states such as Washington and Colorado legalized, they saw is increased by as much as 200% with drivers that had the active ingredient THC present. The fate of marijuana legalization in each state may be different, but AAA Northeast will be there throughout its footprint, providing information and educational resources. We'll try to speak about that later on. This webinar is for everyone. We have an excellent panel here to help us understand the do's, the don'ts, and everything in between. So let's get started. Please help me welcome Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, representing the 35th Legislative District that includes parts of Bergen and Passaic County, New Jersey. Assemblywoman Sumter currently serves on the Community Development Committee, where she looks forward to tackling important issues such as community blight, the wealth gap, and upscaling the needs of New Jersey's small businesses. She is also a member of the Labor and Law Public Safety Committees. Next, we have Mr. Rich Grossfeld. He's a drug enforcement administrator and outreach coordinator for the New Jersey division. As DEA outreach coordinator, Mr. Grossfeld focuses on community-based outreach activities, events, and educational initiatives designed to facilitate the awareness of dangerous drug use and abuse within communities. Help me welcome Mr. Don Shuck, AAA Driver Improvement Program Instructor, Drug Recognition Expert Emeritus, and retired police lieutenant with the town of Yorktown, New York. Don has been a AAA Driver Improvement Instructor since 1990 and has facilitated New York DMV point and insurance reduction programs throughout New York Metro and Hudson Valley regions. He's certified and recognized with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the drug recognition expert, for over 20 years. Don has been a part of the development and improvement of the DRE classifications program in New York State. He was honored in 2011 as a Drug Recognition Emeritus for admirable service for the International Association of Chiefs of Police evaluation program. Our very own Ron Esposito joins us this afternoon, who is a retired Union County Police Lieutenant and Public Affairs Associate with AAA Northeast. I am honored to share the platform with Ron, and he will take over from here to help kick off this webinar. Great afternoon, Ron.
Thank you, Roz, and thank you for putting this all together. I got to say, as ex-law enforcement, this new law intrigues me, and I'm really excited about hearing about it. So without wasting any time, Assemblywoman Sumter, can you tell us, what does this bill have in it, and the revisions that are made, what does it mean to us citizens here in New Jersey?
Sure, and thank you, Ron, for that question. Thank you, AAA, for having me. Thank you, Roz, for the wonderful introduction of all of the panelists and the work that you do daily to keep us safe as drivers throughout the country. Truly, this legislation, this change, this move to making the use of cannabis, adult use for recreational purposes, legal, is about restoration. It's about renewing. It's about reinvestment, and it's about equity. All of those things fell into this bill. So for us, it was important not only to legalize adult use, but recognizing the devastating impact of violence and criminalization of Black and Brown people throughout the war on drugs. Uh, it was about improving families that were targeted with violence. It was about intervention. It was about appropriated tax incentives for social equity. All of those things were included in a 240-page bill. However, none of this could have been done, and Roz mentioned this earlier, without people. The people of New Jersey voted unanimously to legalize adult use. So it wasn't just a legislator's perspective. It wasn't just law enforcement perspective. It was the people of New Jersey making that defined decision. It was also about coming up with rules, fees, and fines. And that's where it got a little complicated for us. The rule part, we created a cannabis regulatory commission, a 5-member board that would regulate, govern medical and recreational cannabis use, and they're still building out the rules today. We set that up as legislators. The director is an African American woman who was also with the American Civil Liberties Union, a policy wonk, as we like to say, but committed to making sure that we try to get it right with the regulatory commission to establish rules for municipalities and counties to follow, let alone the state. Where it got a little dicey, and that's where the legislator comes in, was the enabling pieces. What were the social equity pieces, the criminal justice reform pieces, expungement language for automatic expungements, and a commission to report and track the volume of applications, fees, and the number of completed applications for expungement for nonviolent drug offenses that were overcharged since 2012, we've tracked in New Jersey. So we took the time as legislators to work through a number of these pieces. Now, one might think, why did it take so long? Especially after the voters approved by unanimous vote in a large overwhelming majority in November for New Jersey legislators to agree on the reforms that took place. The bill was laudable, but we had to be sure as a Black member and the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus that we received the social equity justice pieces that should accompany this legislation. We did learn from other states in Denver where the impact was not seen financially by legalizing adult use recreational cannabis. So we work for restorative pieces, 70% of the revenues towards restorative justice, which include economic, education, and environmental justice. It was imperative for us that we made sure that communities who were most harmed had a healing process and also had funding to support restorative practices. We also wanted to be sure that there was a commission for the Office of Minority, Disabled Veterans, Women, Medical Cannabis Business Development, that the licenses didn't just go to wealthy license holders, but we had an opportunity for minority women, disabled veterans to also participate in this new business enterprise that we were forming in the state of New Jersey. We also created impact zones, which again, to advance the equity and restorative justice for those communities that were gravely terrorized by drugs and unequal enforcement of drugs. In 2012, there were more than 24,000 arrests for marijuana possessions, nonviolent ones, in the state of New Jersey. So approximately every 22 minutes, someone was arrested. Cannabis possession arrests also constituted 3 out of 5 drug arrests. And African Americans were nearly 3 times more likely to be incarcerated for possession, despite similar usage rates with white counterparts. So this 240-page bill tried to correct some of the systemic and structural bias within the use of marijuana in cannabis and within the carrying. We also had a decriminalization component, which was important to us to end arrests for possessing less than 6 ounces of marijuana. And it passed with bipartisan support. So we took a lot of pains to have lengthy conversations. These conversations also included law enforcement for the drug recognition expert components. We also recognized that the cost of criminalizing for the use of marijuana that is now legal is too costly to our system. So we really wanted to make sure that this legislation had a restorative impact, a reinvestment in communities that were most harmed. And truly, I have to thank the Speaker of the Assembly, which is Craig Coughlin, the Senate President Steve Sweeney, Governor Phil Murphy, for taking the time to listen to our concerns as a community, for us as legislative members, making sure we connected and coordinated with our communities respectively across the state to make sure that it was a comprehensive bill that at least it started, if you will, down the road to legalization. Now the real work begins with us figuring out the unintended consequences and learning what we don't know. And I'll pause there, Roz, and thank you for that, Ron, for the opportunity to at least give a overarching view.
Excellent. Thank you, Assemblywoman. That's just great. I have a few questions. One of the questions that has come up is can a person grow their own marijuana for their own personal use? And if they can, how much?
So right now, you cannot grow your own marijuana in the state of New Jersey. So there are bills that have been put forth for home grow. But again, there's no meeting of the minds right now. If you grow one plant, it's up to 3 years of penalty of incarceration in the state of New Jersey. So again, we're trying to work through some of the details. The first goal is to get the commission up and running. We actually have full board appointments. It's 5 positions there, and that's where we're looking for the regulations to come out of. We also had to use people power, and I mentioned this earlier, because there was not a Black male on the commission review board, and we talk about the disparate impact of the onerous enforcement of drugs and nonviolent drug offenses. To not have a Black male on that commission was a travesty. So again, commendations to Governor Murphy for correcting that oversight. And we have Charles Barker, who was a former aide to Senator Cory Booker, now on the commission, as they form out the rules and start having more robust discussions about what the rules and regs will look like.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that so much. I do have another question. Can you take marijuana from New Jersey, where it's legal, into, say, New York, now that New York is a legal state? Can you transport it?
So that's a loaded question. And when I say it's loaded, because we went through a lot of work since 2009 on the medical use of cannabis. And for those law enforcement officials who are on the Zoom, you know that some states gave you a medicinal use marijuana card or ID to indicate that you needed it for medicinal purposes. And when you travel to other states, it was not honored. So if a person was visiting a family member and they were using medicinal marijuana for either mental illness or cancer treatment, and we've heard heart-wrenching stories on the need for medicinal purposes that did not transport past state lines. So New Jersey, at least in our bill, we made it so that you can transport showing identification or either a medicinal use card, but not having the onerous regulation or either stops and charges if you're transporting from another state for New Jersey. if you're using it for recreational purposes, and we had long, lengthy discussions on this. We can't attest to what other states will do, but thankful that New York finally moved to pass the legalizations because we're so close. One of the cities that I represent and hail from, Patterson, is 20 minutes from New York City, so not far at all. So the hope is that law enforcement will recognize these laws, that will socialize them, that will connect and coordinate our rules and regs so that you don't have the transport issue of being stopped because one state is different than the next. Super excited about the federal government move to establish a banking system for cannabis as well, which we just learned in the past few hours. Because again, how do you bank it? How do you set up a monetary system for the legalization and the marketplace, if you will? And those are all the things that we're trying to do. And the commission that we've established, the hope is that they talk with other states and stay informed, connected, and coordinated. So again, we can deal with all of the unintentional consequences and challenges with setting up a new marketplace on something that was prohibited that now is legal in a number of states.
Fantastic. That's great. The one last question I have for you is that I get a lot is edibles. Are they going to be legal in New Jersey? And if they are, how are they going to be packaged and controlled? So that kids don't get into that type of thing.
Sure. And Ron, I think so. Roz mentioned this earlier about the THC levels and driving. And I think, Don, you dealt with this with finding drivers on the road. I'm also in mental health by day, emergency room visits for substances within the system, cause of accidents, what we learned from Denver. So while edibles are legal, we're monitoring, and the reason we wanted to regulate it, truthfully, is because of the THC levels. Now, I can tell you in full transparency, being in mental health, this was a hard pill to swallow. Some of my concerns with bringing adult use, recreational use of cannabis online is the mere fact that you are introducing a substance as legal that could cause more harm than good to an individual. However, knowing that there were more instances where you didn't know or have packaging or labels or THC levels controlled, and that's a strong word. While we want individual freedoms, but knowing the controls that could cause harm and limit ability and function. So at least regulating the use of edibles or what THC levels are in the edibles, let's say it that way. And we've learned in this process that language matters, words matter, right? Making sure it's not laced with fentanyl, which is quite deadly. Making sure that people know what they're purchasing, holding a marketplace responsible, and legalizing the adult use of cannabis and creating the marketplace has given us the opportunity to make sure that there's packaging, that there's that you know what you're purchasing. And also, I will say, being able to, again, decriminalize nonviolent drug abuse. We've also added treatment to this legislation. So if someone needs treatment, just like if you had a gambling addiction, that would be available for you with the warning labels as well, all critical and important to me to make sure that everyone has access if they are abusing a substance. Also dealing with the trauma. So being sure that, we know that when people use substances, oftentimes it's related to a trauma that they have experienced. Not just recreational. So if they're in that space, allowing a space as a state for them to receive treatment, because it was often prohibited to Black and brown communities who couldn't afford a private drug treatment facility. So making sure we put a mechanism in place there. And then also giving folks who have a nonviolent drug offense an opportunity to expunge those records. And that requires them to take an action to apply to the county of prosecution where they received the charge, to submit an application for expungement at no fee. Those fees could run as high as $300 to get a record expunged. So it's very costly. And we heard testimony from people who, in their youth, tried, sampled marijuana use, was having fun, and it has prohibited them from an economic future, from earning, livable wages to support themselves and their families, now well into their 30s, because they forgot about that charge, and then all of a sudden it shows up on their record. So really, we try to double down in that space. We're working with the Attorney General, who also gave some directives, if you will. In New Jersey, the Attorney General is one of the strongest Attorney Generals who can actually give directives to have law enforcement not charge for a stop if there's marijuana in the car. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but none of this is easy. It is complicated.
And I appreciate it. I think that you answered it elegantly and hit all the points. I have one last question, if you don't mind. If I were to smoke marijuana in this new age, can I smoke it and pass it to a friend without getting in trouble? What is the law with that about sharing it and that type of thing, and where you could smoke it, so to speak?
So Ron, interestingly enough, you would not get in trouble because you are an adult of legal age, and hopefully the friend you're sharing it with is an adult of legal age, and that's over 21. I know you might be about 29. So we must keep that part clear. You can't smoke in open public places, and that's the same for cigarettes at this time. So we really try to model some of those rules, since it is a form of a tobacco leaf. So we try to model no smoking in public places, so you're not infringing upon the fresh air and environmental factors of the public. If you are purchasing as an underage minor, we did a lot of work, and I'm sure you read a lot of articles about making sure it was not criminalized that young person. We know that youth may sample. We don't want it to end their future because they sampled and they may have been out in public. We want law enforcement to have a safe engagement with the underage person. We're not looking for law enforcement to be the enemy or to be parents, quite truthfully. We also had to work on parental notification. Again, we were working fast, trying to, again, work with the people. And I always say it's people power, because that's what the public voted unanimously to legalize it. We had to come up with some rules to support the public's objective, and that's the job of legislators and lawmakers. So when we missed that field, we wanted to make sure that we cleaned it up, and we're sure there's other things that we missed that we didn't think of that will come to us. But it was important that we not be too onerous, that we allow room for the Cannabis Regulatory Commission to weigh in, that we even allow for AAA to weigh in on some of the needs and things that they're seeing, and that we provide oversight and legislative action to meet those needs, but provide guidance in partnership with law enforcement, the Attorney General, and the public to be sure that we're not causing more harm than good. One of the commitments I made as a legislator when I came into office in 2012 is, if I can't make it better, I won't make it worse. So it took me some time. We started having this conversation about recreational use of marijuana in 2016. And as I shared, mental health professional, it was too broad. We held, as a Legislative Black Caucus, hearings across the state to hear from people on the fears, the challenges, the harms, the necessity, not only from use, but also from over enforcements of charges and criminality, loss of life, gateway use. So all of those things weighed on our shoulders as we came up with this legislation, but no bill, what I've learned is no bill is perfect, and we truly spend the time on improvements to meet the needs of the public for today and for tomorrow.
Excellent, excellent, fantastic words, and they mean a lot to me, and they mean a lot to, I think, everybody on this panel. Thank you, Assemblywoman. We appreciate. Is there anything you'd like to add?
So I'd just like to share that, you know, the goal is for us to make sure that we do things as best we can. We learned a lot from Denver. We learned a lot from Philadelphia. We learned a lot from Canada. So truly what we're trying to do in New Jersey, and you know we got Jersey pride, right? We know that we can do things well, and we know we do things the best because that's the Jersey pride and the Jersey way. But we want to be sure that we're able to pivot, we're able to make the corrections that are needed, but we can only do that as lawmakers with people, with conversation with business entities in order to adjust some of the things that may not work. It's critical to learn that we open the space, not only creating a modernization of a marketplace, but also allowing small entities, small businesses, women, minorities, disabled veterans to participate in this marketplace, and also allowing the communities to weigh in on their neighborhoods, their communities, and making sure we're not overtaxing people, which is what you don't want to do for something that has now become legal. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you again so much for joining us. And I think I learned a lot, and I appreciate all of your diligent work on getting this through and doing it right. Thank you again. Next up, we have Rich Grosfeld, who will show us a little bit of what he knows about marijuana and we need to know about marijuana. Rich, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody who's viewing this program. I appreciate your time and attendance. I'd like to thank AAA for putting this all together. I think this is a great program. And I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for taking the time today to be a part of this program. So I have a PowerPoint slide. I have a lot of pictures. I think pictures are worth 1,000 words. Just real briefly before we get into the heart of it, my name is Rich Grosfeld. I am the DEA Diversion Outreach Coordinator. My background really quick, I was a special agent with the DEA for over 28 years, and I was forced to retire. We're mandatory retirement at 57. I know I look about 39, but I hit mandatory. And I work back with DEA now as the outreach coordinator. Every DEA division now has what they call an outreach coordinator to get out into the community to raise drug awareness during these times. So kind of that's my background in a nutshell. And the other thing I do is I try to work a lot with drug prevention coalitions. Again, just basically raising awareness. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I have a disclaimer slide. I have to post that when I do this presentation. The other disclaimer items I have is one is I am not an expert on the state law by any means. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an attorney, but my goal today in these next 10 minutes or so is I kind of want to give everybody a better understanding of what marijuana has evolved to, and kind of, especially when we talk about potency, and even more important, what we're seeing as far as concentrates are concerned. Next slide, please. Just real quick, again, I work with the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, and we are on the federal side. That's why I said, I'm not an expert in the state law. Kind of as far as what we do in our mission, it's kind of like trifold. The three pictures there, we do enforcement. We enforce the Controlled Substances Act. That's one of our missions. We have DEA Diversion Unit. That's the unit that investigates the pharmaceutical crimes and does regulatory work with the pharmacies. And also the last part is we do our outreach. We celebrate Red Ribbon. And again, we try to raise drug awareness, working with different coalitions and with the community. So, and again, because I'm from the federal side, I just have to, make a reminder that in the federal system, all forms of marijuana are still illegal. And that's under the Controlled Substances Act. And basically there's 3 criteria that they use for that. One, that the substance has a high potential for abuse, that it has no currently accepted medical use in the United States, and that there's a lack of accepted safety for its use. So, again, that's the Controlled Substances Act that on the federal side. So I just kind of wanted to remind everybody of that to start off. Next slide, please, Mark. Just real quick, so kind of everybody has an idea what we're talking about. When we talk, and I'm going to start going into THC in a second, but what are cannabinoids? Cannabinoids are the group of substances that are found in the cannabis plant, and there's more than 100 of them that have been identified. And the main ones that we kind of talk about recently are the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is your THC that you've heard of before, and CBD, which is cannabidiol. Today we're going to be mainly talking about THC. CBD is a whole nother subject. So when we talk about the THC, that is the substance within the cannabis plant that causes or produces the psychoactive effects. Next slide, please, Rob. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the goals was to kind of show you where we are nowadays with the potency of THC and marijuana. You can see back in the 70s and 80s, it was a low 3 to 4%. Now, we're over 15%. Your high grade will have 20%. And now we're getting into something new that we've seen is the oils and the concentrates. And that's what I kind of want to make everybody aware of today. We also have something that's coming out, which is THC acid, which is anywhere in the high 90s percentage of THC. So when we talk about, we're going to talk about the concentrates and the extractions a little bit. Next slide, please, Mark. Okay, we're going to talk about marijuana extracts and concentrates, and this is what we're seeing. So what is an extract or a concentrate? Basically, when you take the marijuana and you extract the THC from it. Next slide, please. So there's a couple ways to do it. You can do it organically, or you can do it with chemicals. And I'm sure everybody has heard of hashish or hash. That is kind of when you extract the THC from marijuana in a more organic way. And you can see the different products that are up there. I said, as I had mentioned, I have a lot of slides, a lot of pictures. So again, it's just taking the dried resin and extracting it. And what you can get is you can get a gooey liquid, you can get a pasty liquid, and you can get oils. And this is just one of the extractions. Next slide. So now let's talk about the concentrates that we're seeing. I know today is 420. 420, for those of you, I think a lot of you know, used to be the code word for marijuana. But now we're seeing one of the newer terms is 710. You see that first on the screen. 710, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is oil spelt backwards and upside down. So, and I have some more pictures of these different concentrates. They're also referred to as Earl, another term for oil, hash oil, earwax, shatter, butter, and I'll show you examples of each one of these. And again, as I had mentioned before, that THC acid, which is in the high 90s as far as percentage goes with the THC. Next slide, please. These are a couple of the pictures. And again, it kind of like the picture describes what it is. Shatter is a form. It's kind of almost like a peanut brittle. You have butter, wax, and then you have oils and saps. Next, please. And one more. And this is like a dust. Okay, this is another extraction, and I'll show you in a second when we talk about extractions what we mean and how it is done. Next slide, please. These are just more examples: shatter, wax. Next. So when we talk about the extraction process, what exactly is that? How do we get these concentrates? What you're doing is you're taking the plant material from marijuana and you're using some type of flammable, whether it be butane, isobutane, ethanol, and you're extracting that THC from the plant. Now, depending upon how refined you get, depends upon what kind of product you get. The problem that we're seeing with some of these extraction labs is, next slide, please, the extremely dangerous nature of some of these flammable liquids, the butane, the isobutane. This was out on the West Coast. It was an extraction lab. Next picture, please. Because they are so flammable, they can be extremely dangerous. One more, please. So that's basically how the extraction is done. The more it is extracted, or the higher refined the process, that gives you your different products. And refined the most, that's what gives you the THC acid, which is in the high 90s. Next, please. I know edibles had come up, and I just want to talk a little bit more about them. Edibles are, next slide, please, just to give you an idea of what some of the pictures are, okay? I have a number of photographs. Edibles, a couple things about edibles. One, you'll notice through these slides, next slide, please. They're bright colors, they mimic candy, they mimic ice cream, sodas, and they're unfortunately made very attractive to youth. And the other one or two things about edibles that I think everybody should be aware of is with edibles, when you digest or take an edible, it takes longer to digest and longer to feel the effects of the THC that is in the edibles. Unfortunately, what will happen is people will not feel the effects. They'll start taking more and more and more, and then all of a sudden, it'll really hit them. And that's when now you're taking larger doses, and which can result in anxiety attacks, paranoia, hallucinations, and also can cause respiratory issues in our youth. So again, next slide. These are just some more pictures. Okay. Obviously, they're made to mimic other products. Next. Fruity Pebbles, again, very colorful, and unfortunately, it's made to entice our youth. Next slide. The last thing I'm going to mention basically is the concentrates in vaping. Unfortunately, it was almost like a perfect storm. Vaping and e-cigarettes came out, as well as the marijuana concentrates. Next slide. And these are just some of the vaping methods. You can do flowers, the oil cartridges, and then the concentrates we were talking about before. So a couple of the things about the vaping THC. Usually there's no odor when somebody vapes THC. It's easy to conceal. It can be masked by other flavors that will come in the e-cigarettes. And unfortunately, now that we're seeing the higher concentrates of THC, next slide, please. What we're seeing is the people are vaping the THC cartridges or the THC dabs, as we say. I'll mention that in a second, but they're higher concentrate. So they're getting the more effect of the THC, which is basically they're taking in more of the psychoactive elements of THC. Next slide. And I had mentioned dabbing. Dabbing basically is another term. Dabbing is a process of using the concentrates, or if you take a dab can be, a little bit of that oil or butter or so forth. Basically what you're doing is vaporizing that concentrated marijuana by heating it up and inhaling it. And again, the problem we see is that the high concentrates of THC affect more as far as the cause more of an effect of the psychoactive elements. Okay, that's pretty much my time. I want to thank everybody again for tuning in, and I thank you again for your attention.
Rich, thank you. That was a great presentation. I love the graphics, really, really good. The one question I have for you, because you're more in tune with the federal laws, I get questions all the time like, if I'm flying from some place to another place and it's legal, say in California and in New Jersey, can I bring my marijuana with me, or do I have to wait to purchase it there?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on the different states' laws, but flying is your TSA is a federal agency, and my answer would just be that still it's federally illegal, no matter technically what amount.
Good advice. Good advice. Thank you, Rich. I appreciate
Sure.
your time and your presentation. Next up, we have Don Shutt. Don is going to tell us a little bit of what the DRE program is and the procedures that need to take place for the DRE to get involved and ultimately decide whether someone's impaired and give enforcement and credit to an arrest for marijuana and other drugs. So Don, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation and the opportunity to finally get the information across as to what law enforcement has available to identify impairment, which is the devastating factor on our roadways that causes crashes, increases risks, and is deadly on our roads. Law enforcement has a trained response to this. And on our roads nationwide, we have trained officers that are drug recognition experts, DREs, we call them. They form a critical role in ensuring law enforcement keeps our roadways safe from impaired drivers. They're highly trained and tested officers. And here today, we're going to take a look at the Drug Evaluation Classification Program, the overall national umbrella that identifies specific programs that helps officers and trains them to identify impairment in their efforts to get impaired drivers off the roads. Most officers start with the basic standardized field sobriety testing course, the SFST course, which every uniform officer receives in the academy, straight through to the DRE, the highest level of specific training for that. So as a retired lieutenant, uniformed road officer, over 25 years law enforcement experience, a DRE instructor, DRE emeritus, as has been said already, I've seen the risks that are on the roads. And it's always a fine balance of choices, weighing the risks involved with those choices, and then understanding the consequences of those choices. And something I do want to express today is that simple possession of all the substances we're talking about today is not impairment. The key that we want to stress, especially through AAA and driving safety, is to ensure that the choices you make don't get carried out onto the roads and impairing situations, heightening the risks that are involved. For instance, the most basic elements, if you're driving with a parking permit hanging from your rearview mirror, let's think of it as a minor risk. We see it all the time. What's the violation? Maybe a summons for it. And the consequence of that is a ticket. But did you ever think of it as possibly obstructing your blind spot behind that park permit, where you could strike somebody behind that obstructed view area and cause injury or death? So we need to think through on the seriousness of all the consequences. Think of choices and decisions. We're not saying, yes, it's okay to do it, or no, don't use these substances. It's your choices. Think of the risks, the consequences, but always be able to answer one question: how can I get home safe? So here, when we're at this situation, the officer stopped a vehicle. Impairment was observed way before this stop by the officer. The officer gathers observations of vehicle operation by identifying the movement of the cars. Is it swaying? Is it having difficulty staying in its lane? Is it operating excessively slow or over exaggerated responses? These are all the thinking and doing processes in driving that are impaired when people use substances that impair their responses while they're driving. So law enforcement has specially trained officers that are used to properly identify subtle signs and symptoms that indicate impairment that may lead to these deadly consequences. The first is ARIDE officers, Advanced Roadside Impaired Detection Enforcement. It's a 2-day course that officers receive to identify driving actions of impaired drivers and how to properly assess them to determine what type of substances that they may be impaired by other than alcohol. The more rigid training process is the drug recognition expert then, which identifies subjects post-arrest. After officers have identified impairment on the road, drug recognition experts are then utilized to articulate, identify, and document signs of impairment that would help with prosecution and also then with the follow-through assistance of the individuals that have been arrested for impaired driving. Advance, please. So this is the relationship between the three different types of processes. So it always starts with the basic, down on the bottom, standardized field sobriety testing. Every officer on the roads has received this training. They can identify alcohol impairment. And alcohol impairment is something that most of us are very familiar with. We can identify people who have consumed alcoholic beverages and become intoxicated. And we've all seen people who have consumed alcoholic beverages and not become intoxicated. But the key issue behind impairment from drug substances is that impairment is to any extent unsafe on the roads because it affects the thinking and doing process of those drivers. And on the road, we have hundreds of thousands of officers that are trained then additionally in the advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement. So ARIDE builds upon the standardized field sobriety testing process, gives the officers some additional testing protocols, including a finger to nose test, a lack of convergence test, where they assess to see if the eyes can cross following a substance that is brought closer to the person's field of vision, a critical skill or step in identifying depth of field while you're driving and operating a motor vehicle. And we'll see that coming up in a few slides. And also the Romberg balance test, identify a person's ability to balance while their eyes are closed and estimating 30 seconds. We can all understand how some drugs may speed up that process if it's a stimulant, or it could slow it down if it's something similar to cannabis or a narcotic analgesic or a painkiller, as we know that. It could slow down that process. So that's what officers are doing, identifying specific impairment that would cause a problem on the road from somebody being able to operate a motor vehicle safely. DRE, as I said, is a post-arrest process. And nationwide, there's over 7,200 trained officers in drug recognition expert. New York State has over 296, and New Jersey has 415 trained and certified drug recognition experts that are available to help support the post-arrest impaired driving process. Advance, please. So these are some of the basic tests that we've seen. It includes some of those that we understand as the eye test, checking for what's called horizontal gaze nystagmus, doing the walk and turn test, a 9-step walk and turn test, or doing the one leg stand, a 30-second leg raise test, where officers have all been trained to identify alcohol impairment. Well, the subtle differences that are observed when there's actual drug impairment. The eyes give specific indicators. We'll see that in a few slides coming up. Then the walk and turn test, which is usually a 9-step walk and turn test with impairing substances such as cannabis. We see that people can't focus on the directions, understand directions, and often can't follow those simple directions where taking 9 steps out, doing a turn, and coming back 9 steps. Often they forget that it's 9 steps, and they may be counting out 28 plus steps before the officer has to stop them for safety reasons. And even with the one leg stand test, there's specific indicators that are observed during that test for people who are involved in drug impairment. So what exactly is a DRE? Next. A DRE follows a 12-step standardized process, but here I'm just showing you the three critical steps or decisions in the road that the drug recognition expert would follow through on their 12-step evaluation. First of all, they're going to identify if there is impairment. They're going to rule out if there's any medical impairment, any other pre-existing conditions on the individual where maybe hospital or medical attention is required for follow-through. or it could be another type of toxicological response that is not impairment from a drug substance. And we've seen many drug recognition experts assist individuals in the medical response to ensure their safety. If the DRE does identify that it is impairment, they'll go on and determine specifically what category, 7 different types of drugs that the individual may be under the influence of based upon shared symptomologies, signs and symptoms that are regular common body responses that individuals have when they're taking impairing substances. Advance, please. So this is the DRE process. Starting on the top left, there's a 12-step process, initially with a breath alcohol test. And on this breath alcohol test, they're identifying, is the impairment solely from alcohol, or if there's no blood breath test reading and there's significant impairment, they'll follow through, interview the arresting officer, following through on the steps we see, eye examinations, taking vital signs, looking at specific detail during this 40 to 45-minute process called a DRE evaluation. They'll finish up with the last 2 steps of forming an opinion based upon their interview with the subject in front of them, and usually get some very candid statements from individuals who express and show their drug impairment and show their drug usage freely to somebody who asks them and talks to them about the process. The DRE then follow through with a toxicological examination. They gather either blood, breath, or a urine sample, or possibly saliva based upon which state and the state rules and department rules and regulations in order to corroborate what is actually going on in the individual's body at the time of the evaluation. This is a standardized and systematic process. It ensures no mistakes are made, that no examinations are left out, and that it's fully court acceptable. Advance, please. As part of the process, DREs use a pupillometer, that card that's on the side of this woman's head, in order to show standard responses to drug use. Here is an example of dilated pupils. They're larger than normal, and that's common to drug symptomology that we see with people on the influence of stimulants, hallucinogens, or cannabis. So we can look across the room, common lighting elements. However, those individuals that have excessively large pupils may be on the influence of cannabis, stimulants, or hallucinogens. It's not one sole indicator. It's the totality of circumstances. That's why it's a 40 to 45-minute detailed examination. So the DRE looks at blood pressure, pulse rates, body temperature, standardized eye tests, and actually checks the muscle tone, which is a response from the body based upon the substances placed into the body. And we can also see in the next slide, please, advance, is something that we're all familiar with and we've seen: constricted pupils, very small pupils. And these are common to people who are on painkillers, or the category we call narcotic analgesics. Now you're saying, what's the specifics with this? But it's something we've all seen. We've seen those loved ones that have been post-surgery, that are on painkillers, narcotic analgesics, have responses like this. It's a normal, natural body response to the chemical placed inside their body, but it causes impairment. Imagine trying to operate a motor vehicle when you can't focus as well or see as clearly. Or has anybody actually had the eye examinations where their pupils were dilated and then possibly attempted to drive? It's very unsafe. So an additional test also in checking the eyes, which is the gateway to the soul to understand the impairment of individuals, is that lack of convergence test I described earlier. It's the ability of eyes to track an object as it comes closer to your body, into your field of vision, closer to your eyes. Your eyes feel like crossing, and it's a standardized medical test in which officers identify if the person's eyes cross and follow the stimulus. It helps in determination of depth of field, a very significant factor that's needed for safe driving habits. And the common response then, as I said, is crossing the eyes. Here in the next slide, we'll see a video of this being shown. Here, the officer moves the stimulus around, the eyes come in, and they should cross specifically and follow the stimulus into the middle of the nose. Notice where the eyes jut out to. They don't follow it and immediately go out to this driver's left side. So they're unable to have a good focus on depth of field. We see this with people on the influence of cannabis, and often results in increased rear end collisions in impaired drivers. Next slide, please. And then striking motor vehicles that are in front of them. So here today, I want to show law enforcement has specialized training. They have the personnel out on the street that are trained to identify impairment and operation of motor vehicles in order to remove individuals that are showing impairment, unsafe driving habits, and DREs, drug recognition experts, that provide the documentation and support for successful prosecutions to help reduce the amount of deaths and injuries that are on the roads. So there's choices. There's choices that are on the road, and we want to make sure that you assess the risks and the consequences, because law enforcement personnel are trained, they're ready, they're knowledgeable in order to make sure that our roads are safe and removing impaired drivers. And I thank you for this time and the opportunity.
Thank you, Don. That was really, really informative. And I think everybody has a better idea of what New Jersey officers have at their disposal to eliminate these impaired drivers from the road. Thank you again to everybody. Roz, I know that you'd like to say a closing word, so please take it away, Roz, and thank you again.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and attention on this hot topic. And I just would like to remind the audience that driving is one of the most dangerous things we do. Driving impaired is dangerous and deadly. As previously mentioned, the growing threat of drug driving, especially in states where marijuana has been legalized, is alarming, and particularly with teens. To help the dangerous outcomes of driving while impaired by marijuana, I'm so proud to announce that AAA has launched new initiatives at combating drug driving. Our outreach team has had their boots on the ground for about 3 years with our award-winning presentation called Shifting Gears that explains the blunt truth about impaired driving via marijuana. It is presented in driver ed and in health classes, and you may feel free to visit AAA.com/community. We are in the community for the community, and we are so proud to be able to present this throughout our footprint. Once again, on behalf of AAA Northeast, we thank the Assemblywoman, we thank the drug recognition expert emeritus, and we certainly thank Mr. Rich Grossfeld, drug enforcement agent, for his time, his attention. And most of all, Ron, I thank you for co-hosting this event, this webinar. We sure we're going to be having this conversation probably with our New York team. And on behalf of AAA Northeast, stay safe, be well, and please don't drive impaired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.